my name's Tamsin Russell and I work at the Museums Association, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here today talking about wellbeing. In terms of the presentation, I'm going to share my slides in one moment, and you'll also get copies of these slides as part of the post-conference pack. I'm going to cover quite a bit of ground in the time we've got together, but my approach, bear with me, I'm just trying to share my slides. Brilliant, apologies about that. The approach to this session is around having a duty of caring, and the ING is a really important part of this. So this isn't a one-stop shop. This is about caring for the well-being of your volunteers from the point at which they demonstrate an interest in your organisation to when they decide to exit. So it is an ongoing responsibility. And as part of that duty of caring, we have a moral and ethical obligation, as well as a legal obligation under the Health and Safety at Work Act 1972 to support the well-being and physical, emotional and psychological health of our volunteers. In terms of the Museums Association, we are the UK-wide membership body for people that work in and with museums, and that includes freelancers, paid staff, as well as volunteers within the sector. So what are we going to do today in the time that we have together? So you'll see I've got quite a few questions here. I want us to explore what we mean by well-being. I'm going to talk about self-care, and I'm going to highlight a particular resource that is there to help you. I want some opportunities for you to reflect on your role in creating and potentially not creating a culture of care. And again, what do we mean by that? And the last part of today's session is around thinking around a team wellbeing plan. So how can you create a plan that prioritises the wellbeing of the volunteers within your team? Within all of this, the backdrop is the Museums Association research into workforce wellbeing that we undertook in 2022. And you can see there's also a bullet point around questions and answers. So feel free to ask questions in the chat function, ask questions of others in the breakout sessions. Feel free to ask questions of yourself in terms of what you need to put in place to support the wellbeing of your volunteer group. So the Museums Association is committed to positive workforce experience, and that includes freelancers, paid staff and volunteers. We want inclusive and diverse museums to prioritise fair working conditions and workforce wellbeing. When we started our research in this area, we defined wellbeing as being the state of being comfortable, healthy or happy, but we acknowledged that that wellbeing is affected both by our home life and also our working life. As part of that, we felt that whilst often well-being is looked at from an individual perspective, it is important to note that workforce well-being is an indicator of a healthy and productive organisation, and therefore if the well-being of the workforce is compromised, that is something that the organisation needs to take seriously and look to address. We feel so often that when we talk about workforce wellbeing, individuals feel the burden to change their behaviours at the expense of what the organisation perhaps could be doing for them. So, first of all, I want to hold this space and I want you individually to reflect on these two questions. What does good wellbeing look like for you? And how do you know when things have dipped? Now, this is an individual exercise, so you have got 3 minutes to start this thinking, and I will call you back into the space at 11:24. And just to let you know, there is no expectation that you share any of the answers to these two questions. This is just your individual reflection about what good well-being looks like for you and how you know when things have dipped. 3 minutes, go. Okay, so hopefully what you've reflected on is what makes good well-being for you, and also when you feel that your well-being has dipped. What does it look like for me? So here's a case in point. So for me, good well-being looks like enjoying my job, looking forward to going to work, being energised, smiling, generally up for everything. How do I know it's been dipped? is when I become far more myopic in my thinking, i.e. I am more short-term. I tend to think just for the day ahead. I tend to not sleep well, or I sleep too much, so I take myself away from different places so that I can get some respite and not have to deal or have any interactions. I forget the names for things. I begin to blame others, so I become sort of a little bit curmudgeonly. Physically, I get eczema, and I also adopt coping mechanisms. I often adopt unhealthy coping mechanisms, though, which might include a gin and tonic at 5, and, as we've already discussed, salt and vinegar or ready salted crisps. So the reason it's important for you to identify what good well-being looks like for you, and also when it is dipped, is so that you can see the signs as early as possible around where it is being compromised. And so you can then put things in place to support your well-being. Okay. Individual exercise, 3 more minutes. What factors affect your well-being? Again, you're not going to share this with anybody else. It's 11:26. We'll bring you back at 11:29. I want you to think about all the factors, either positive factors that support your well-being or negative factors that affect your well-being, or things that are absent that might affect your well-being. Okay, 3 minutes, go. So those are 3 questions. So what factors affect my well-being? So here's one I prepared earlier. So workload, difficult behaviours of others, lack of respect or recognition, micromanagement, or equally lack of interest in what I'm doing. So there are a variety of factors that affect my well-being. The reason I think it's important for you, 1, to identify what factors are at play is that then enables you to have a more productive conversation. Because if I just say sort of generically that my well-being has been wobbled or is less effective, then that's great. But what it doesn't enable me to do is to put in place a particular remedy to that particular aspect. So if I'm feeling my well-being has been wobbled because there's a lack of respect or recognition, I need to make sure that I'm giving feedback or seeking out the opportunities to get recognition or value from others. So identifying the factors that affect your well-being is important. Identifying which factor is at play at any one point in time is critical to enable you to put in place something that will make that be addressed. In the Museums Association research in 2022, these are the 5 factors that were most commonly highlighted as having a negative impact on well-being. And obviously, you can see the one that says 44%, which is around pay, wouldn't relate to volunteers, but other aspects absolutely would. So there was something around excessive demands being placed on individuals, and that doesn't have to be about workload, but it could be those excessive demands relating to being out of your comfort zone or having to do tasks or activities that you're not feeling confident or able to do. There was this absolutely 48% of people said not feeling recognised or valued in their organisations meant that their well-being was compromised. Problematic cultures and team working behaviours, and then also impacts around opportunities for progression. And by progression, we don't mean sort of just traditional opportunities to work your way up a hierarchy. We mean more broadly around progression in terms of learning or undertaking tasks and activities that are meaningful. So these might have been some of the factors that you've identified that have an impact on your well-being as an employee, potentially, but equally these can be generalisable to the experiences of volunteers also within the sector. What does self-care look like for you? So we have worked out what well-being looks like, so when it's good. We've worked out how you know when it's dipped. You've already reflected on the factors that affect your well-being. So what does self-care look like? Self-care is, let's define our terms, the practice of taking action to preserve or improve your health. So that could be physical, psychological, or emotional. And it does require you to take an active role in protecting your own well-being, particularly during periods of sort of high demands or pressure. What is really important as part of this is that just because I am taking more proactive interest in my health and well-being, that doesn't remove the responsibilities from others. The legislation is really, really clear that organisations have a responsibility for your health and well-being, as do line managers as part of their duty of care in a line management situation. So whether you are looking up to the people that are managing you, or whether you are looking at the teams you yourself manage, volunteers or staff, there is absolutely a responsibility that sits with the organisation and the line manager. I highly recommend Self-Care Associated with Cats. As I look at Charlie's screen, that's already made me smile. So what does self-care look like for me, apart from cat action? Finding joy wherever I can. So I love Christmas. I throw myself into it. It's very shallow, but this is my charger. This gives me joy. I communicate my feelings and my status very clearly with my line manager. I don't think that's always easy to do, but I do so. I know my limits and I now say no. I have a support group on a WhatsApp that says, having a really rubbish day today, can we touch base? Whatever it might be, whatever self-care looks like for you, identifying what works for you and what doesn't. It's really important. On the MA website, we have a web page dedicated to making an individual wellbeing plan, and it takes you through in much greater detail than I've just done in this session, the details about thinking about the factors that affect you. And there's really helpful template, very straightforward, not complicated at all, that gets you to think about how you can view your wellbeing. And this can help you as a checklist yourself, or you can use this as a document to share with your line manager to have a conversation. I think sometimes if we can sort of point at things or highlight things in a meeting, either digitally or in person, it can be really helpful to get your views across. So I've just focused on you in that first 10 minutes, 15 minutes of today's session. Let's focus on the people you have a duty of care on, the volunteers. So what about volunteer wellbeing? What does it look like for them? How do you know when things have dipped for them? What factors affect their wellbeing? Now, if I was going to be sitting here asking myself those questions, I really wouldn't be getting to the nub of it, because I would be making assumptions about their wellbeing. I might be projecting some of the answers that affect my wellbeing on them, and that might not be their reality. So what I'd like you to do as part of the breakout exercise, and Charlie's going to put you into a breakout exercise for a full 10 minutes, is how do you know what the well-being is like of the volunteers that you manage, that team that you manage, that individual volunteer? How do you know what good well-being looks like for them? And what do you have in place to support your knowledge gathering around their own well-being? And what can you put in place to find out more? Because if you're not proactively engaging with the concept of well-being of your teams, you are working opaquely and blindly in terms of how you might support them. So I'm going to stop sharing my slides. And I'm going to, thank you, Charlie, perfect BBC link. I've got 10 minutes to discuss those questions, and I'm going to pop those questions in the broadcast area as well. We just spent 10 minutes, you discussing with other volunteer managers, supervisors and coordinators, what you have in place to know what the well-being is of your teams. And I think this is a really important point. And I think we need to prioritise what those check-ins look like, because there is a real risk that with everything else that we're having to do, whether that is around attracting new volunteers or whether it's around supporting other areas of our work, to prioritise our volunteer well-being is important. So I asked you, how do you know what your volunteer wellbeing is like? What do you already have in place to support your knowledge gathering around that? And is there anything else you might need to put in place to find out more? I've not asked you to share any of this verbally. Feel free, if you want to, share some hints and tips in the chat function. from our perspective, so Museums Association perspective, one of the pieces of clear recommendation that came out of the research was around creating a culture of care. And what do we mean by that? So a culture of care is an organisational or a team culture where leaders, managers, supervisors consistently act in a way to help team members thrive, okay? So this is our starting point. How do we make sure we're doing that for the volunteers that we support? Now, I support 200 volunteers and they all work remotely. So I have additional challenges as part of this. As part of our support, there's also acknowledgement that individual co-workers might also be people that support the well-being of others. So there is also a responsibility for other volunteers to support the well-being of other volunteers. And the hope is if we put all of this in place ourselves and we create this culture of care, then our visitors, the communities we serve, the audiences we serve will absolutely feel that in all of their interactions with us. And that can only be good for the heritage sector and in terms of visitor loyalty and access to our collections and all of those things that you already know really well. So what can we do? What can you do? What can we do to ensure that we're creating a culture of care? So from my perspective, there is something around ensuring we have explicit statements at all of the touch points with our volunteers. So whether that's in role descriptions, advertisements, the induction programme, volunteer handbook, a standing agenda item, either at one-to-ones or at volunteer meetups, so that we're explicitly highlighting that wellbeing is a priority for me as the person who is the person supervising volunteers, but also for them as well. So what those explicit statements are about. And as part of that, I'd also suggest you look at any policies or practices that are in place in your own organisation and look to see whether they are applicable to volunteers. There's no reason why that policies or practices associated with, respect and dignity, well-being, anti-harassment, anti-bullying can't also be extended to the volunteer population. And often it can be an oversight that volunteers aren't explicitly highlighted or described in those policies. I think there's something about being proactive. So I've already talked about individual wellbeing plans from your perspectives, but you can apply those in terms of how you support your volunteers. So you can highlight the fact that individual wellbeing plans are there to help them, and you would suggest or encourage individuals to complete those so that you can be cited as their line manager around how you can support their volunteering and how you can support their wellbeing. I think if you get pushback or if you want evidence to support why you're committed to creating these culture of care, then look at the research that we've done. There's lots of metric points that you can use to highlight why this is a priority for you in your team, but also if you need to influence up within your own organisation, why it's a priority for your organisation. In addition, obviously, to being proactive, there is something about having and keeping a watching brief around what is going on and not ignoring any signs or signals that might indicate that a volunteer may be struggling or may have their well-being compromised. So if you suddenly see a volunteer's behaviour change, if they become less responsive, if they become more assertive, if they're more withdrawn, if they're taking or unable to participate as much as they have done before, those are all clear signs and signals that something might be going on. So rather than ignoring those, use those signs and signals to enable you to have those conversations, which is just about reaching out and saying, how are things? ? You don't have to say, actually, you've seen a little bit more withdrawn recently, Charlie. Can we have a discussion about that? That's not necessarily going to land well. But asking questions about how are things? ? Sit back, be quiet, can really enable the volunteer to share with you what might be going on. You might want to signpost, just as a matter of course, other organisations or support networks that help look at both physical and psychological well-being, so whether that's Mind or Cruise. So having those contact details at hand and perhaps including those in a volunteer handbook or on a volunteer notice board, even a digital notice board can be helpful. I think sometimes we find it difficult perhaps to have one-to-one and individual conversations about well-being. Sometimes can feel quite personal to have those conversations. So I do appreciate that. So that's why I think sometimes using sort of hooks to have a sort of a broad brush conversation about well-being can be helpful. For example, last week was Anti-Bullying Week. Also, it was World Wellbeing at Work Week. So you can use those weeks that exist. It could be Inclusion Week in September, whatever it might be. It could be, there's so many different trigger days or hooks or weeks that enable you just to highlight the fact that volunteer wellbeing is a priority for you, and have they looked at these resources. That signposting enables you just to have that conversation. You may want to also measure wellbeing. So for those of you that do volunteer surveys throughout the year or at particular points, that can help. There might be an item about, how has your wellbeing been supported this year? How would you rate your wellbeing? And particularly if you're doing seasonal volunteering programs, there might be a point at the end of October where you stop and just say, how was it for you? Okay. Or when people are welcome back for April, if you're into seasonal volunteering, what's important in terms of your well-being. Other aspects that could support your management and support of the well-being of your volunteers might be about some personal disclosure about how they might know when your perhaps well-being is not as strong. I mean, you want to be a buffer for them, but there might be something about acknowledging, so for example, 2 weeks ago, I said to all of my colleagues at the Museums Association, I was feeling sort of quite overwhelmed. I had lots going on and I wanted them to be cognizant of that. I felt comfortable sharing that information with them, and that can make you feel more human, that can make you look more human, and also it can mean that that person then feels more comfortable to share their fluctuating well-being experiences as well, because they feel as if they'll be heard and supported because you've already disclosed. Positive volunteer management behaviours in terms of being available, that old adage, my door's always open. Your door's always open, that's great, but if you've got a grumpy look on your face or you're then not present, then actually that's a ridiculous statement. So think about those positive volunteer management behaviours that create that culture of care, and that might be about being available, it might be about being present, it might be about being open, and all of those other things that I've highlighted here. So we have done a huge amount of research into this. We got a really good response rate. More than 650 people responded, majority admittedly from an employee background rather than volunteer background, but a lot of the findings are generalizable across both groups. So key findings, I'm not going to talk you through all of these, I'm just going to highlight some of them really, was that the factors affecting people's experience or negative experience of work and well-being were around excessive demands, so too much work, being asked to do too much too quickly, not feeling recognised, not feeling valued. How easy is it for us to say thank you or to celebrate success or contribution or call out people for doing something well? It's easy, it's cheap for us, but meaningful for them. Third of respondents felt they just didn't feel cared for. So even though their organisations had policies in place, how that landed with them on a day-to-day basis didn't make it feel a reality. It felt to be tokenistic rhetoric rather than the reality. So again, if you can be saying very clearly throughout all of your communications that well-being is prioritised rather than just saying, have a look at this policy, that can go a huge, huge way to ensuring that people do genuinely feel cared for. Other aspects I just want to highlight is, the real positive approaches around wellbeing were all around those interactions with you, ultimately, as volunteer or line managers. So people talk very clearly about having an empathic team or empathic manager and having interesting and meaningful activities and tasks. One of the things I just wanted to highlight here is that certainly from an employment perspective, there's been a shift to hybrid working, and the research was completely clear that has had a significant positive impact on well-being. So again, my challenge to you guys would be is think about where there are opportunities to look at remote or digital volunteering and what that might mean in terms of conveying positive well-being effects to the volunteer workforce. There are loads of recommendations that I'm available on our website, you know, from creating this culture of care. That's what I've been talking about for ages. Proactively planning around wellbeing, sufficiently resourcing in terms of the number of volunteers that you need to do something well, so they're not feeling ridiculously stretched or compromised, or I can't take a break because there's not a volunteer here. Making sure that wellbeing support that's available for employees to a greater degree is also available to volunteers wherever possible. Making sure these policies and practices that are written are delivering for your volunteers as well. I've already talked about measuring wellbeing and those check-ins. You yourself as a volunteer manager, supervisor or coordinator may not be invited to the same level of management training as your peers that are managing paid staff. I never understand this, but it is something that comes across often. So if that is something that's the case, please let me know at the MA, but also let HVG know, because we can easily put in place a mini workshop around wellbeing, absolutely, to support your management of particular scenarios around wellbeing experiences, centering people in all conversations. There's a whole raft of recommendations. So final breakout. So Charlie, what I'd like you to do in a moment is break out for 10 minutes. I want you to think about, and I'll put the recommendations in the broadcast, to think about, you know, actually what exists in your organisation to support wellbeing in general, and is that applicable to your team that you manage, your volunteering team? What could you implement to support more supportive volunteering experiences? How could you affect change? So in 10 minutes, I want you to share hints and tips about how you can improve and create this culture of care for your volunteers. Absolutely great. Everyone's coming back into this aspect. Fantastic. Wonderful. So what have we done in the time that we've had together? And we've been together now for about 55 minutes. We have looked at what we mean by wellbeing from our own personal lens and what that means in terms of our own personal self-care. And I've highlighted the individual wellbeing plan. We've started to explore how you as a volunteer manager and coordinator can think about what wellbeing looks like for your own volunteer teams. How can you understand what it is and how it's fluctuating? And then also your role specifically in creating this culture of care. So what is in place? What policies are in place? What do you do in terms of your volunteer management behaviours to create this culture of care? I've also, as part of this, highlighted the Museums Association's research into this area of work, which I think can be helpful, first of all, to enable you to influence internally, but also to highlight why this is important for you and your practice. What we're going to do in the last couple of minutes is just talk about how you can then take all of this and synthesize it really in terms of a team wellbeing plan. One of the things I know is that we're all very busy, and with the greatest will in the world, whilst you come back from conferences and think you're going to do loads of things quickly, what invariably happens is you get sort of pulled back into the realities of work. So I think if you can identify 5 things that you want to do as a result of today's session, and then put those in place over the next 12 months, that's still 5 things that you wouldn't have put in place previously. So I challenge you to think about, what's your next step going to be for this month? What one thing are you going to do between January and March? What one thing are you going to do between April and June? What one thing are you going to do between July and September? What one thing are you going to do between October and December? Because that means this time next year, you'll have done 5 things to support the well-being of your teams and also to support your own personal well-being. And if you're supported, then they are also going to be supported. So 3 questions I think is always helpful whenever you're looking at making change in your working life is, how will you involve others and who will those people be? Who else will help you? And is there any other information or research that could help you in your thinking? So first of all, without a step of hesitation, how do you ensure you're supporting the well-being of your volunteer teams is by asking them. So you cannot think that what affects your well-being will affect their well-being. So please involve them at the earliest stages when you're looking at addressing volunteer well-being. Also look at our resources. We have this research. We have a wellbeing hub that has a range of different hints and tips pages, signposting, as well as previously recorded content all around workforce wellbeing. We've also got a brand new kid on the block, which is a workforce wellbeing workshop. So if you're a Museums Association member, please have a look at our website and you can apply to participate in that. The other aspect I think is important is, depending on your context, there might be different wellbeing challenges. So if you're managing primarily an operational team, you might want to look at our front of house charter for change that has a range of recommendations all around wellbeing. If you identify that perhaps there's a hostile environment in which your volunteers are working, internally or externally, you might want to look at our bullying in museums. So we've got other research that can support you in your way to manage your volunteers' wellbeing and support them. So look at those, all those recommendations, 91 in total you could have a look at to inspire your thinking and look to improve your practice. So what we've done today is looked at wellbeing. We've looked at self-care and created a language and a definition about what those things are. And we've also looked at defining a culture of care. And words can be really important to enable you to move forward. What I've talked about is the research, and just now in terms of following up this whole idea of essentially a team wellbeing plan. What are you going to put in place over the next 12 months to increase the wellbeing of your volunteer team? And I'm going to send a template to follow. Duty of caring, because it never ends. And I am now going to stop sharing my slides and hand over very quickly to Charlie to say thank you before we all go back into the main room for the next session. Over to you, Charlie.
Thanks so much for that, Tamsin.